I live in the dorms on campus at Eastern Michigan University. And while strange things tend to happen to my roommate, I usually just shrug them off. I was raised in a rather non-traditional, physically sensitive family, and was brought up not to fear the paranormal, but to respect it, and still know how to protect myself from it using shields and simple incantations or rituals. This has always been more or less second nature to me, and I've never felt truly threatened by any presence around me. Until recently. Christmas break rolled around this year, and my roommate went home the day after her classes ended. I've slept alone in our room before, and I was leaving as well the next day, so it wasn't a big deal at all. When I went to bed that night, however, things felt somewhat different. I shrugged it off, figuring I was just overtired, and closed my eyes. As soon as I did, I got an exceedingly clear mental image of an older man standing a few feet away from my bed, glaring at me. This was disconcerting, but I opened my eyes, counted a few sheep to get rid of my lingering image, and then tried once more to go to sleep. After all, it was probably just my imagination. I've seen similar mental images before, ranging from people I've never met in my life to elephants and tutus. Though this wasn't exactly a dancing pachyderm, it was hardly unusual. But still, I couldn't sleep. I kept getting the feeling that there was something near the foot of my bed, standing in the doorway to my dorm room. This reminded me that I hadn't locked the door before laying down, so I reluctantly stood up to go lock it. I didn't want to walk through those few feet of space. It felt like there was something there, and I didn't want anything to do with it. I quickly locked up and dove back into bed, closing my eyes tightly. For several long moments, everything seemed okay. Several years ago, I began learning how to use my energy to gently influence things, pendulums for the most part. Though on occasion, in crowded areas, I would use it to subtly keep people away from my personal space. I could form a barrier that could discourage people, on a subconscious level, from getting too close. I've always done this to some extent when I was younger, but have only recently begun to do it on purpose. Learning how to do this has made me more aware of my aura, of the energy that surrounds me, and sometimes I can tell when someone is thinking very hard about me, just based off the changes in my own energy. I bring this up because I began to sense changes in my aura. I felt like someone was playing with my energy, perhaps sucking it away. It has happened a time or two before, in my bedroom at home, but there, all I need to do is tell it rather forcefully to stop, and it does. I did that in my dorm room, and nothing happened. So then I put up that shield I've been using for so long, but still nothing happened. As I did this, I began to sense sort of a shape that went along with the bad feeling at the foot of my bed. Whatever it was, it reminded me of the velociraptors from Jurassic Park. It was non-human and still somewhat small, but still quite dangerous. Finally, I imagined a sort of energetic bomb going off, filling the room with bright white light, and the beings seemed to vanish. I haven't noticed anything out of the ordinary so far, now that we're back, but then again, it has only been 2 days. I'm hoping that whatever it was, it left for good. It was my freshman year of college, and I had been living in the dorms for a few months now. My dorm was set up as a suite. 3 bedrooms, 2 girls per room, 1 bathroom, 1 living room. My roommate was no longer at college, so I had the bedroom to myself. One night, as I was falling asleep, I heard my roommate's empty bed start to squeak. At first, I thought it was just the bed settling, as furniture had the tendency to do that at night as the air cools. However, the squeaking got louder and louder, and soon it sounded like the bed was actually shaking. It really freaked me out, but I just closed my eyes and made myself fall asleep. When I woke up in the morning, I thought I must have imagined the previous night's occurrences, so I just continued on with my day. But that night, the bed started shaking again. The next morning, I checked all around the bed to see if maybe it had been pushed up against the wall, and it was just the neighbors banging on their wall causing the bed to move. But the bed was a good 5 inches away from the wall on every side. This shaking bed continued every night for at least a week, maybe even longer. Looking back on it now, I can't believe that I didn't do something about it sooner. I can't even believe that I was able to fall asleep each night with the amount that bed was shaking. Finally, one night when the bed was making noise, I said out loud, "Please stop, just please stop." It never happened again. There was, however, one more incident that occurred in my dorm. One that scared me even more than the bed. I was getting ready to go out one night. All of my suite mates were already out, so I was the only one in our suite. I had just finished getting dressed and I wanted to look at my outfit in the mirror, so I went in one of my suite mates' rooms. Their room was the only one with a full-length mirror. I walked into the dark room and flipped on the light switch, but the light didn't come on. I started to walk across the room to the lamps sitting on the desk when all of a sudden, I heard a loud, urgent whisper that came from the closet saying, "Michelle." I ran out of that room as fast as I could and didn't stop until I had made it safely into my friend's house. I ran over all the possibilities in my head, but nothing made sense. I was sure it was a whisper in that room, and not just a muffled shout from a neighbor. I am 100% positive that I was the only one in my suite that night. I tried to do some research to see if there were any reports of anyone dying in my dorms, but I didn't come up with anything. I've always believed in ghosts, but I'd never any type of remarkable experience apart from these. I still get goosebumps thinking about that whisper coming from that closet. I was living in an apartment complex in a college town with 3 roommates. Though there was really just 2 of us, my best friend and I. The other 2 guys were always gone back at their parents' home, or work. After a few months of living at these apartments, nothing had really happened to us. We were just normal college students, partying and doing schoolwork. But after 3 months, we started hearing scratching noises in the wall. We thought it was just rodents or neighbors or something along those lines. But then it got weird. One day when it was just my best friend and me, we were playing Xbox in the living room. We paused and left the controller on the table in front of the couch. We also had a counter by the kitchen and a tall circular table in the corner of the other side of the room. We both got to the kitchen at the same time and we hear the Xbox controller icon moving on the screen. And the sound that the television makes when you are scrolling was going off. We thought it was incredibly weird, but probably just the controller sticking. But when we got back into the living room, we found that the controller was now on the high top circular table. We checked the house to see if anyone was there and didn't find anyone. We would have seen anyone walk in because the only way in and out of our apartment is through the kitchen. That was really the first thing that happened. Next, I came home from class and I unlocked and walked into my room, turned on my television, and walked back out to talk to my best friend who was watching golf in the living room. I put in some food for lunch and walked back into my room and saw something incredibly weird. There was an imprint on my bed like someone was sitting there, but there was no one there. There was an imprint on my bed like someone had been sitting there, but there was no one there. I reached out to try to touch it, and it was incredibly cold. But as soon as I reached out to whatever was there, it disappeared, and the imprint started to fade. I freaked out. For a few days after this, I accused my friend of trying to scare me, but he was just as terrified as I was. He was having experiences of his own. In his experiences, the paranormal were a little more forceful. He always came in from hanging out with people around 2 a.m., and he was going to his room when the door leading to his side of the apartment slammed shut in his face. This happened 3 to 4 times, and then stopped. He also experienced things moving on their own in his room, like pictures falling over and posters being ripped off the walls. The scariest thing that happened was when we were watching an NBA game, and we heard a loud crash come from his room on his side of the apartment. We both were too terrified to go back there, but I took my phone out and quickly took pictures to try to catch something on film. Nothing showed up. We both finally manned up and went into his room. Everything, and I mean everything, had been lifted up off the ground, flipped, turned, and dropped. His bed was all over the floor and his golf clubs were everywhere. We had no idea what to do, but we stuck it out for the last month. and then moved the heck out. I never did any research, mostly because the apartment complex wouldn't tell us anything anyways. I set up cameras multiple times, but nothing ever showed up on video. The activities were very random, so it was hard to just choose the right night. The complexes weren't built on any cemeteries, but we were really just 400 to 500 meters away from one. Since I've moved out, I haven't had any ghostly experiences, and neither has my ex-roommate. It was my first year of college at the University of Cordelia's, and I was taking a BS nursing then. We have our own building separate from other colleges, and all 8 floors are occupied. My schedule back then started at 7:30 a.m. for anatomy and psychology. Our classroom is located on the top floor, and I hated it so much because the elevator isn't operational up until 8:30 in the morning. One time, I was running really late. I had to take a cab going to school, and the challenge there was for me to climb up all the stairs. So when I arrived, I rushed to take the stairs and find that there are a lot of people trying to catch up to their own classes in the morning. Adding to that busy day were students loitering around the corridors. Since I was almost late, I quickly ran into the fire exit to have a better chance of getting there on time. And yes, the fire exit was empty, so I ran as fast as I could to reach the 8th floor. Everything was normal until I was on the 5th floor. It was the fire exit, so you can imagine how narrow the stairs are. It wasn't as creepy as you are imagining it now, though. It's bright and clean. I was approaching the said floor when I noticed a child, around 7 or 8 years old, sitting in the middle of the stairs. His face was on his knees, so I can't really see if he's sleeping or just resting his head. The kid looks okay. He was in his school uniform, only that it was one of those old uniforms that you see in your mom and dad's class pictures. It was totally fine, thinking that he's just waiting for his parents, who might be one of our instructors in the university. So I excused myself, but as soon as I passed beside him, he started whining and crying. I did not pay attention to it and continued climbing up the stairs. I was almost on the 7th floor when I noticed the kid's crying started to get louder and louder, so I took a quick peek from where I was to see what was happening. And yet there he was in the same position as earlier, so I started walking again. I felt my chest beat fast as I reached the 7th floor to find the same kid in the middle of the stairs. Only that he's now standing up, looking straight into my eyes with a pale face. And guess what? His feet were not touching the ground. I immediately went out from the fire exit and ran straight up to my classroom. Shortly after, I was rushed into the clinic due to the hyperventilation, and I can't even explain it to the nurse, thinking she might say I was insane or under the influence of drugs. Later on, I'm starting to hear so many encounters from other people on the same floor of the fire exit, but as of now, no one can tell us the history of the boy. This story is fairly brief, as the incident was rather brief in itself. I am currently a mature student at a college in Bedfordshire, studying fine art in a specialist art block. To make sure I get the best use of the studio, I often stay after normal hours to do extra work. Now, the art block consists of 2 floors, not including the ground floor, and the studio I work in is on the top floor. Usually, there's staff or a few students wandering about, but on this occasion, it happened to be an open day and everyone was in the sports hall in the adjoining building. Seeing as I am classed as a mature student, the last member of staff handed me the keys to the studio, asking me to lock up the floor when I was finished. Everything was normal for the first hour or so. I sat in the small studio with the portioning wall to the larger studio ajar. Concentrating on my work, I put on the radio and began to sing along. Halfway through the singing, I heard the door to the large studio open, then footsteps walking up the side of the patron. Thinking it must be a member of staff or someone that was lost, I paused my music and said, "Hello?" The footsteps sounded as if they were coming up to just behind the opening of the Patreon and stopped. So, thinking I may have startled someone, I popped my head around to look into the larger studio. But there was no one there. Shrugging it off, I put my music back on and continued with my work. But the same thing kept happening. The door would open, the footsteps would walk in my direction, then I would pop my head around, and no one would be there. It was early December at about 6 p.m., so outside was almost pitch black, and these noises were beginning to make me feel a bit uneasy. So I decided to lock up the studio and go do some work on the large printer/photocopier at the end of the hallway. I was a little unnerved still from my experience in the studio, and the floor I was on felt eerily quiet without my radio playing. So I made up my mind to photocopy just a couple more bits, then go home and finish my work on Monday. But as I was photocopying my last page, I heard the door at the other end of the corridor fly open and someone running up the corridor towards the double doors behind me. Nearly jumping out of my skin, I turned around to see who it was, but just like in the studio, there was no one there. My grandmother always used to tell me that if a spirit is trying to scare you, you need to stand your ground. Then they should stop. So, fighting my urge, I looked down the corridor and said out loud, "Can you please leave me alone? You're not scaring me." Then, feeling a tad shaky, I turned back to the printer. Unfortunately, my speaking out did not work. I suddenly heard running on the stairs, banging, and the double doors behind me began to open and close a little too violently for my liking. So, needless to say, I grabbed my things and ran. I have not been on that floor alone since. Although my curiosity and urge to help others makes me want to return there alone to see if whatever is there needs help. That was 5 true paranormal stories from colleges. I never stayed at a college, like I never dormed in a college, so I was pretty curious to see how many stories there were about this kind of thing, and there's a decent amount. I had to look through a bunch of them to find the ones that I personally found interesting and wanted to narrate. So, if you guys have any ghost stories of any kind, feel free to send them in. I have a few submissions already in my email that I am going to probably narrate next week. So if you want to send them in, please send it to GhoulishGal15@gmail.com. I will put it in the description, as well as my Facebook is also in the description. And don't forget, my last video will be on the top left, and then my next video will be on the bottom left. And remember, there's always someone or something watching you.